You think you're cooking for yourself, choosing what's on your plate. But what if the recipes you follow have been quietly scripted by corporations? Tonight we step into a kitchen where advertising and hunger collide and discover how the food we love has more to do with marketing than the market. Here on Things Visible and Invisible. Christina Ward is an author and editor. She is the publisher of Feral House, a publisher noted for books well outside the mainstream. Among her many books is the intriguingly entitled American Advertising Cookbooks, How Corporations Taught Us to Love Bananas, Spam and Jell-O. And she joins me down the line from her home in Wisconsin. Christina, welcome back to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you, Sean. It's a delight to speak with you again and have this conversation about the kind of secret history of foods.
Well, that's what really intrigued me about your book, Christina, because somebody once said to me that advertising is all about lying. And when I saw the title of your book, that came back to my mind. There's one thing about telling us that a certain look will enhance who we are, be it clothing, makeup, whatever it happens to be. But there's another one which is around what we consume in terms of food, something that we have to do to stay alive. And I think although there's a lot of fun in what we're about to discuss, would you agree that there's a kind of potentially sinister undertone to this discussion?
Oh, there's an absolutely sinister tone to this because what corporations do is make money. That's their sole focus. And when we talk about food, that's a people issue, people, animals, and the labor in making food and growing food. And so, of course, when you inject kind of nefarious capitalism on top of, as you pointed out, a requirement for living, you get some fairly dark intersections.
Absolutely. Well, I know from our last conversation, Christina, you're also very much a historian of the consumption of food and how food enters into the mainstream. We had a fascinating discussion about religious cults and sex and how that played a part in constructing the American diet. Let's go back a little bit into the 19th century, early 20th century, and look at when advertising began to see this as an opportunity.
Yeah, and this is an exciting kind of thing to look at because it is relatively modern. And so we have a lot of artifacts that we can go back to, and the history's documented. And one of the critical things, the thing that changes it all for food and advertising, is one single person. And it can be challenging to point to a change in history to one person, but here we can. Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays is credited as the father of modern advertising. But why? He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the essential founder of psychoanalysis. And Bernays studied with his uncle and understood these psychological concepts, these deep-seated motivations, the urges, the ids that make people do things without even understanding that they're making an influenced choice. And so when Bernays comes into the picture, right after World War I, even though there had been food advertising before that, Bernays changes everything by introducing the psychological manipulation aspect of advertising.
Now, people have in the last maybe 20 years become aware of the Bernays figure and his influences upon the world we live in for all sorts of reasons, which we're going to get into. But let's just paint, if we may, Christina, a little bit of a portrait of who he was. Yes, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is the father of psychoanalysis and a certain aspect of psychology. Talk to me a little bit about this Bernays figure. Was he somebody who was a psychologist first, or was he purely an advertising man who decided that psychology might be the route into his audience?
It's an interesting pathway Bernays took. He was first and foremost a New Yorker. And so he was the son of Freud's sister and raised in New York. and had grown up in that, also in a fairly elite situation. He was friends with the Dulles brothers, and I'm sure your listeners will recognize that name, who the Dulles brothers were. And for those who may not be aware, the Dulles brothers were, again, from the American elite, interested in government and went on to serve in government. And their friend Bernays also served in government during World War I. They worked in the information office, which is a very nice way to say propaganda. And so these three fellas knew each other, worked together in propaganda. And that's where Bernays actually started. So he used his psychological training that he had. He didn't practice as a psychologist, but when he met up with the Dulles brothers, they started working on American intelligence. And Bernays started using and teaching the Dulles brothers as well some of these psychological manipulation techniques.
Would you say that this triumvirate had an agreed worldview?
They had an influence in their world, in how they remained friends and how they were going to work together. And so these three people show up in specific food history in many different ways, and how they overlap into kind of world politics as well.
So, I mean, they came from the same class, probably the Northeast elite, as you say. So they would have shared, I'm assuming, the prejudices, the worldviews, the outlooks of that group.
Yeah, absolutely. Which was a very paternalistic view of what in the States we call it WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of culture, even though Bernays was historically coming from a cultural Jewish family. In New York, that gets tamped down, and everybody in elite becomes an elitist, really, and kind of adopts very much the same kind of cultural they go to the same schools, they go members of the same clubs, later for Jewish people to join. But they're with each other all the time. And so in that bubble, you're only influenced by the other. And of course, if we go back to then just the general politics of the United States at that time, is we were in the midst of what they call the Jim Crow laws, which essentially institutionalized racism. And so that view that people who were not white were definitely lesser. And if you were not members of that upper middle class, that elite, you were also lesser, because the other influence was this Protestant Puritanism, this Calvinism that said that you're rewarded for your whiteness, for your wealth. It's a gift from God. And so people of that time period genuinely believed they were better than other people.
So, I mean, to put it rather bluntly, you have on the one side perhaps the Jewish idea of being the chosen, and then you've got the Calvinist idea of being the elect, fueling the thoughts of this small group. When it comes to the masses, which they're interacting with, and we're going to talk about that in a second, you use the word paternalistic. Was it basically that the masses were not people? They were just a sort of lump, if you like, within society, or a society that needed to be corrected, tamed? Was there a fear to some extent after the First World War, with the Russian Revolution and everything that was happening in Europe? Was there a fear about the masses that they needed to be controlled, if in a paternalistic way?
Absolutely, Sean. Your instincts are spot on. So much is happening at that time in the world. Before World War I, there's also a lot of divisiveness happening in Europe that is sending thousands and hundreds of thousands of immigrants, and mostly poor immigrants, to the United States. And that, of course, increased post-World War I. And those people were, one, poor, two, mostly coming from Catholic regions, from Italy, from Ireland, and were very different. They were considered, even I make the faces because they were almost not even considered 100% maybe human. This notion of whiteness only comes a little bit later, and many Irish were considered lesser. Italians were considered lesser. The Jewish people coming from Eastern Europe were lesser. And essentially, these groups, the white people that were here earlier, these colonists, these elitists we're talking about, felt that they had to teach people how to not just be Americans, but how to be a human being in America. And it was this very, again, paternalistic view that the foods they were eating in the old country, the cultural practices were backwards and needed to be modernized. And that idea of modernization really plays a part in how Bernays and how the giant corporations start looking at food.
So there's a kind of two-pronged approach we're exploring here, Christina, I think. Help me out. There's the economic side, which is how do we sell to the masses? The masses have numerical superiority, so how do we sell to them? But there's also a political agenda here, which you've set out there, which is how do we make this disparate group more American, inverted commas, whatever that is, more like us. Are they the two kind of prongs that we're going to explore now through the 20th century?
That is a bigger influence, yes. There's also a third prong involved. So we have money and that kind of societal, cultural things. But we also have what we term in the United States westward expansion. The ideas, especially after World War I, and it really comes to play after World War II, is the American empire. A fear of communism, a fear of lack of control, which capitalists always want stability. And how do you get stability? You control everything. And so by introducing that third prong of kind of global dominion, of empire building, then we start really getting into how food can control people, how corporations can control food, and through that control of food can control people.
Amazing. Okay, well, let's get into that. So we've got Bernays and we've got the Dulles brothers. How do they move from just having sort of intellectual discussions about this into the mainstream, both corporate mainstream and also to some extent the political?
So the first real credited Bernays advertising campaign that came after World War I, after the Dulles brothers and Bernays' work on propaganda campaigns in World War I, was during the 1920s. In the 1920s was the growing suffragette movement in the United States of giving women the right to vote. In the United States, in New York City, on Easter Sunday was always a giant parade. To this day, they still have a big Easter parade where people get dressed up and march down the street. And in the early 20s, cigarette manufacturers were realizing that they were losing market share because only men smoked. Women did not smoke because culturally it was considered dirty, filthy, and unfeminine. And so Bernays was hired by a tobacco company to try to change people's minds, which is a really difficult thing to do. But using the psychological techniques that Bernays really invented, they were successful. One of the first things he did was get a bunch of women suffragettes to agree to march in the Great Easter Parade while smoking cigarettes. And he had signs made called Torches of Freedom, and essentially equated smoking with being a modern woman. If you were going to be a modern woman wanting your rights, you smoked, because that's what the men did, and so go to it. And women adopted that. People adopted that really quickly. It was such a successful campaign. It only took a few years from statistically going to women at almost zero smoking to a very healthy, percentage of the population increasingly picking up cigarettes. And they did it. If anybody's a smoker out there, you know that first cigarette doesn't taste very good. And so there's a little bit of that marketing that really has to go to get over that initial hump of taking it on and keeping with it to build the habit. And so that was Bernays' first successful campaign that's informed every other campaign moving forward.
And what year are we talking, Christina?
This is about 1921, 22.
Okay, so it's at the start of the 20s. There's a lot of societal change. So they convince American women that they need to smoke. Not a very healthy alternative. Does that tell us something about this sort of cynicism around what we're about to explore in terms of advertising and what the body is consuming, or am I being unfair that the health benefits or lack of them for around cigarettes, etc., were not perhaps as well known as they are today?
That's one of the great myths is that, and that the cigarette companies put forward was that we didn't know. We didn't know it was, we didn't know it was so horrible. We're sorry. They knew. So early studies, even that earliest days of science, when science itself was pretty rough around the edges, showed that smoking was not great for you. And how did the cigarette companies react to that? Well, they hired doctors to endorse cigarettes. And so it was really common. You'd see ads in magazines, 9 out of 10 doctors smoke this brand. And so absolutely craven. And so to ascribe any kind of morality to corporations is to really misread what the history is. Corporations, for the most part, act as an amoral entity. Their goal is just to make money.
Was Bernays a sort of gun for hire?
He was. He started his own advertising company. And again, one of the first really advertising agencies, and would take on other clients. And this is where we start to think about and that influence. The other thing happening at the time is the Industrial Revolution is really, kind of coming towards its next phase of mechanization, of food processing, canning, where if you were living in, say, the 1910s, you went to the market maybe every couple days. They didn't have like modern refrigeration. You couldn't store food for that long unless you were preserving it yourself. The advent of canned foods and processed foods intersected with Bernays. And so now people have the access to purchase food. They're also working more hours and have less time to actually prepare food. So that the absolute culture was ripe for someone like Bernays to come along. And so after his first successful smoking campaign, he starts his advertising agency, and then other corporations, seeing his success, start seeking him out to develop campaigns.
Okay, so in terms of the world of food, and you've set the scene nicely in how the world of food is changing, how we consume it and how it's produced, etc. Was Bernays an acute observer of these patterns? Was that the thing that gave him the edge in terms of how he was going to market this? Or was it his uncle's psychotherapy thrown in as well? Or was it a combination of both?
I think it's the combination. He had the leg up by having this understanding of Freudian human psychology. He understood that at such a core level that he was really the first person in kind of this advertising world to really connect that. It was previous to Bernays, advertising, especially for food, would have just been, buy our product. You'd see an ad in a magazine of a very cute baby. It was attractant to something to just attract your attention, attract the eye, and then the ad would tell you how good their product is. And that's fine. But with Bernays, that changes, and he starts telling you who you are, and how you become who you are is via the product. And that is a really critical change in how American advertising, then worldwide advertising changes. And so it's really that understanding of human psyche that changes how that advertising is approached.
I think that's a really, really significant point, Christina. I'm just thinking it through. Before that, corporations or whoever was selling were selling to customers. But it seems that Bernays was not so much creating a customer as as what? I'm looking for the word, a consumer, somebody, the ideal consumer, somebody who was in need of this product psychologically. Is that where we're heading with this?
Yeah, he created demand. So he created a demand environment so that only this specific company could supply. And the demand environment is that psychological state of, wanting, of we all need food, but what do we want to eat? And that is like kind of that difference that Bernays really exploited and by creating it. And a good example of that is Bernays didn't work on this campaign, but it's a good indicator, is like mayonnaise. And mayonnaise started, it's a pretty blasé thing. It's just, an egg sauce, essentially. But through advertising, mayonnaise became something pretty ubiquitous because people didn't know that they needed it. They didn't know they wanted it until the advertising told them that this is what they want. And that is really what changes everything. And Bernays is responsible for that.
Presumably, Christina, this is gold dust to the corporations that are selling, right? If you can promise them that you can convince somebody that they need your product, not that they want your product, but that they need your product. Presumably, Bernays was much sought after by all of these food corporations.
He was, and not just food. And so he used his advertising skills across the board for many different corporations, but he excelled at food. Specifically, he started a relationship early in the 30s with a company called United Fruit. And United Fruit was an amalgamated company. It joined a few times from late 1800s, early 1900s of bananas. And United Fruit was a conglomerate banana producer and exporter of bananas to the United States and around the world. And so Bernays and United Fruit had a very long relationship about bananas. And we think bananas are pretty common today, but they weren't in the early 1900s.
So talk me through that. Let's just take bananas as a case study because I think it's kind of fascinating because I'm sitting here thinking, well, a banana is a banana. I mean, if I was sitting in front of Bernays, I'd be putting the banana down saying, well, how are we going to sell this to the American masses? What sort of thought patterns have you discerned going through Bernays' mind that he was able to take this and make America convinced that it actually needed bananas?
So, and again, if we think about this in psychological terms, in the manipulation of human psyche, here is a fruit that very few people have ever seen before in like the United States, in England. It's not indigenous. It's an African fruit. It got brought to the Central America, to the Caribbean, by Portuguese enslavers and took root in the same kind of climate. When in the late 1800s, the railroad, the Carnegies and all of the expansionists were trying to build railroads, they had to import workers, and they imported a lot of workers from Jamaica who brought their banana starts with them. And where they would do it is, this is such an interesting, as they cleared land for the railroads, the workers would plant bananas because knowing coming back, they plant their banana trees, they could harvest them later. And when you try to build railroads in Central America, you're forced to deal with lots of mountainous terrain, swampy terrain, yellow fever, and it's very, very difficult. But bananas were successful. And so many of these railroad engineers and these companies actually a few of them switched to bananas. And that was actually one of the start companies of United Fruit. And so as bananas now come to the Western Hemisphere, and these companies are losing money on railroads, they have to figure out how to make more money. Bernays comes in and starts that introduction. So the first bananas come to the United States through New Orleans. And as they're bringing workers from New Orleans to work on the railroads, and you never want to send an empty boat back. So they fill it with bananas and bring it to New Orleans. And that is the start of introducing people to just bananas. as United Fruit then becomes, they hire Bernays to try to spread bananas throughout the rest of the world. The first thing they need to do is teach people what a banana is. How do you eat a banana? One of the funny things is when people often first encounter bananas, they weren't sure what to do with it or how to eat it. So the very first banana advertising shows illustrations of peeling a banana, telling you to only eat the inside of it, don't eat the skin.
That's absolutely incredible. So, I mean, Bernays takes this idea, this at his behest of his employer, the United Fruits. Other than something exotic, something unknown, because lots of food stuff can be exotic and unknown, but there's another stage, which is to actually get people to sample something, to try something. How did he go about doing that?
So then the next step is, once you teach people how to eat it, that you can eat it, you start telling people why they should eat it, creating the demand. And so Bernays, his first phase of that campaign was really using the science of the day of, this is it's filled with good calories. It's filled with good energy. It's filled with vitamins. It's filled with all the nutrients you need. And so once you establish that this is a healthy food, it's a good food, then they shift the advertising to women, who primarily were the chief cooks and purchasers of food, and then started talking about how healthy it was. And the best mothers, the only good moms, feed their children, feed their families this because it is the healthiest. So now you start creating the need, the demand, because you created this psychological state in women of, wait a second, am I really doing the best for my family? I better give them bananas. And so that is like that first phase of manipulation, by creating the demand. So once that's established that these are healthy and only the best moms, only the good cooks use bananas, we've got that framing, but now what do we do with them? And that's where then Bernays starts that next phase of, you'll see a lot of the cookbooks. And the fun part on the internet is, I'm sure, Sean, have you seen pictures of some of those early prototype banana recipes?
Mm-hmm. I have. Well, because you've set it up beautifully, Christina, because your book is all about manipulation through cookbooks, essentially. And I'd never really made the connection, but Bernays, as you say, has been given this banana and told to make it popular, and the advertising, as you've described it, is extremely subtle in a way and not so subtle in another way. Just one question on that, because we were talking about the lack of integrity when it came to advertising around cigarettes in the early 1920s. Was there a similar kind of, shall we say, how can we put it, lack of something around this advertising when it came to the banana, that maybe outrageous claims were being attributed to banana? Obviously, banana is a healthy fruit, but was there a great deal of exaggeration in the advertising, hyperbole?
Oh, absolutely. Again, if we think about nutritional science of the time too, and it's pretty freewheeling at the time. As we're establishing what valuable nutrients are. And so bananas were a cure for constipation. Bananas were, you just needed a banana a day kind of thing to get optimized health. You could eat garbage. You could eat candy bars the rest of the time as long as you had your banana a day. So it was very exaggerated as to what the benefits were. And once that happened, everybody followed Bernays' model. And then you see like orange juice. The juice isn't so healthy. It's if you eat the whole orange, not the rind, but if you eat the orange, that's healthy. The juice, not so much. But again, it's the co-opting of science for popular use. And it's also a cultural time when fashions change, culture changes, and people were more health-minded. It's the start of food fads, and that's, again, attributed to Bernays and his marketing of bananas. And then you start to see other advertisers say, well, if he can do that to bananas, I'll do it with grapefruit. So the infamous grapefruit diet was introduced in the 1930s. It recycles about every 25 years. It comes back as like, just eat grapefruit and you will lose lots of weight. That was happened in the 30s. So other advertisers, again, started jumping on the Bernays bandwagon and adopting his techniques for other corporate foods.
Now, you've written about, obviously, and studied the whole business of cookbooks and how they were deployed, shall we say, in this advertising war against the masses. Whose was this Bernays' idea, or was it something that he was observing? I suppose we might need to back up a little bit, Christina. Were cookbooks very, very popular at the start of the 20th century?
So cookbooks became really popular in the early 20th century because paper became cheaper and printing technology became much cheaper. So it was very easy. It's much easier to publish a cookbook. And so early companies were starting to publish very early prototype cookbooks. But again, they were just ingredients lists. They didn't have what we would recognize today as like a modern cookbook at all. Mm-hmm. And so again, Bernays starts saying, here's the thing that's familiar to people. How can I turn it into a tool of manipulation? And that's where Bernays started building with, especially going back to the United Fruit with the bananas, invented the character of Chiquita Banana that has become very familiar and embodied by Carmen Miranda, of the caricature of a Caribbean dancing lady with a fruit hat on her head. And she was also happy and joyful. And it was a representation then of aspirational, of you can eat the bananas, you're going to be healthy, and you're also then touching the exoticism. You get to adopt a little bit of this lifestyle. And that is another of Bernays' techniques about that manipulation. And he runs with that. He runs with that to I think, some pretty interesting places.
Now, cookbooks, presumably at the start of the 20th century, were rather bland affairs. They were paper, but lists, as you say. At what point did they start to become something that we would recognize today? Because when you say cookbooks to me, I think of very, very glossy photography, making food look absolutely delicious, whatever it happens to be. Was this part of the Bernays universe that we're entering into?
Yeah, absolutely, including images and pictures versus nothing or just a line illustration. And they start seeing the first color introduced. Now it's a 4-color process, so that's why when we see some of these old cookbook images reproduced on the internet, our instinctual reaction is like, ugh, I don't want to eat that because the colors are off. But at that time, it was such a technological advancement that it was incredible to that idea that you could see the dish that you were going to make. So of course, Bernays, they lean into that and start developing recipes to use bananas. Again, creating the demand, creating the need to, if you want to make this delicious looking food, you have to buy our product to do it.
So the cookbooks, does he then start to, I'm thinking, you're a publisher, Christina, that's your day job. Was he somebody who worked with publishers then, or was he? I'm wondering, was he the sort of mastermind behind all of this? Did he have his fingers in every single pie, so to speak? So there was the advertising, there was the sales pitch, there was the various ways in which corporations were interacting with the masses. Was he the kind of master manipulator behind it all?
He was, because he invented the playbook, and so. A lot of times in modern publishing, people think about cookbooks are published by a publisher. The difference was with Bernays, and what Bernays innovated was the companies themselves were the publisher. The companies were issuing these cookbooks themselves, and so they had 100% control over what was included, what the messaging was, and what they were trying to convey to people who were, again, potential buyers. And they were offered it free. It was free. You didn't have to buy it. And so we think about the time period, who doesn't love something for free? And so millions and millions of these cookbooks were disseminated throughout the world because people wanted to have new recipes. There's always that sense of novelty of wanting to try new things. And Bernays, again, created that environment and created that demand and created the need and then filled the need. And really took this through the 30s, the 40s, into this place where we know now, where it really comes into kind of goes into overdrive, is post World War II.
Well, we've been talking about bananas, and I mean, in terms of fruit, I mean, it's not the worst thing you can eat, and it's not the best thing, and all the rest of it. And campaigning for people to eat more fruit, not such a bad thing. But Bernays didn't, as you say, as you're suggesting, didn't sort of just stay with healthy fruit, and presumably corporations were wanting to sell us other things, some things that too much of would injure our health. Let's move to the post-Second World War. We've got an America which is suddenly exploding in terms of economic growth, in terms of disposable income, etc., etc. Presumably Bernays and the advertising agencies were licking their lips, if I can put it like that, at the prospect of selling all sorts of new faddish foods to a young post-war generation.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you've got all these soldiers coming back, getting demobbed. Women were in the workforce during World War II and now are being shunted back to homemakers. And that is an element. And we, from an advertising perspective to, make sure women are going back to the homework and not to the factories. And so you see this whole idealized version of the nuclear family, right? Everybody is 2 kids, 1 car in the garage, a turkey in every pot, that kind of thinking. And that's the post-war environment. And the science, too, is we've learned through food preservation technology, is now we can get to where Sean's talking about, of now we can sell them bad food. We sold them fruit. Now let's go for the bad stuff. Because something like, the first thing that pops in my mind is white bread, Wonderbread. And you see the advertising fortified, and you see that with breakfast cereals, which are just little flour bits and sugar of fortified with vitamins, right? And you're like, what? If you actually look at that, there really isn't a way to fortify things with extra vitamins, but that was the advertising claim. So you could eat this cotton candy bread and still get your daily requirements of nutrition. And it was just a free-for-all that the claims being made by these companies were just extraordinary. If you followed the advice of the corporations, if you just eat their food, it would do everything from make you lose weight to cure cancer.
Now, you've used the word or the expression free-for-all a number of times, Christina, and that's certainly the impression I'm getting. Was there no pushback from public health institutions, government agencies, people saying, wait a minute, we just can't tell people that this is Wonderbread or this is wonderful food when we don't know? Was there any kind of check and balance at this point?
No, not at all. And so it goes back to, in 1905 is the United States passed a law called essentially the Pure Foods Act, and which did require a formulary of to be called a food, it had to meet this, you couldn't call just a jam unless it reached a certain percentage of fruit. And so 1905, they established some rules. But at the same time, going back to Mr. Edward Bernays, he realized that in order to countermand government and people control is you had to have another voice of advocacy. And so they started essentially councils, as advocacy councils. So you'll have the Banana Growers Council, the Beef Council, and essentially they're lobbying groups for the manufacturers who then set themselves up as an independent entity and then pay for medical studies and nutrition studies. And so anytime a governmental pushback on a regulation might happen, you could fire up your council to manufacture a study to say, wait, no, our doctors and research says, according to the Beef Council, eating red meat 3 times a day is good for you. And so there was always a counter narrative to protect the corporations and to advocate for the corporations' positions.
And presumably some of that was also geographic. and then you get into local politics, that if you've got a state where beef production is a major economic factor, presumably then they also became lobbyists essentially for the same sorts of corporations.
Absolutely. And then it gets tied into, as you point out, if a geographic center of a production, there's workers. There's people reliant on that. Yeah. And that becomes then a different economic issue, is if you close down the hot dog factory because hot dogs are not good for you, what are you going to do with all those displaced workers? And so corporations become like very much like a mushroom tentacles. They send out the spores that Bernays kind of started this, is to infiltrate every aspect of the economy and the culture, and through, of course, starting in our food systems.
You have researched deeply into this advertising of food, and the title of your book gives a number of these types of food. In all your researches, Christina, what would you say has been the most sinister, the most insidious advertising, promoting something which really doesn't do us human beings any good whatsoever?
There's so many. I think, and I'm guilty of it, soda pop. There is no value in soda whatsoever. It's sugar water. Yet in the early days of soda pop, of, say, a Dr. Pepper, Coca-Cola, those were considered medicinal because they were herbal concoctions held in a sugar syrup. And great. Sure, small doses as a tincture, you might get some gut health benefit from eating, from drinking that, just in the idea of old kind of digestive alcohols. So you've got this medicinal beverage. And again, the advertising takes over and it expands and it shifts, so soda pop shifts from being this medicinal beverage served from a pharmacy at the soda parlor to when it is packaged. And now it can be shipped all over the world and sold to everyone. And that is, and soda pop has taken over the world.
And is it too much to say that soda pop in its various varieties has also contributed greatly to levels of obesity throughout the world?
Absolutely, absolutely. The amount of sugar that, especially in Western nations, and now we're seeing it in former colonial places as in the past 40 years, is sugar is a preservative. And so when you add sugar to foods, it's one of the hurdle technologies that helps prevent pathogen growth. So manufacturers, to make their foods last longer, will add sugars to things. Even a bread, like when I talked about Wonderbread, has more sugar. So we are consuming more sugar than we ever have before. But it wasn't always considered a bad thing. I have, this advertising cookbook from the Sugar Council, the advocacy group for sugar in the United States, published cookbooks in the late 60s, early 70s, geared towards parents, talking about how drinking a soda pop, giving your kid extra sugar, a teaspoon of sugar on their already sweetened cereal, is a good, healthy way to boost energy throughout the day. In our modern sense, that's crazy.
Totally. Christina, you've written this wonderful book about advertising in food, but do you ever think you're also writing really about the secret history of the 20th century, in particular, who really runs the world we live in, and the hidden influences in everybody's life?
Absolutely. I like to talk about history with a small window, because I think it tells us a larger story. When we talk about specifically food advertising, as you can see in our conversation, we're having a bigger conversation and about this history. I mean, if we keep going, by the 1950s and 60s, with Bernays, we bring our Dulles brothers back into it. United Fruit owns most of Nicaragua, of Costa Rica, of El Salvador. These are colonialized countries. The people have very little rights. When the revolutions in Central and South America started happening in the 60s, the same thing with the liberation movements in Africa, they don't want to work on these company-owned plantations, and they start militarizing and fighting back. Bernays, in defending his company, United Fruit, calls up his friends, the Dulles brothers, who at that time are in charge of like the CIA and working for American government, and they essentially start a war. The banana republics, the countries, they send U.S. troops. They send mercenaries down to suppress these revolutions so they can keep their bananas growing, so they can keep everything growing and keep the money churning. So when we talk about that sinister, the dark, that influence, you wouldn't think that a banana can cause a war. But in fact, bananas cause wars.
Christina, I think this is the point we're going to pause here, because this is absolutely fascinating. I really do think that you are uncovering a secret history of the 20th century. And as you say, it all revolves around the innocent banana and how it comes into the American psyche and how it's manipulated for all sorts of reasons. And you're right. I mean, the name Dulles for most of us is linked to the CIA. So the whole thing starts to take on a whole different hue as the 20th century progressed. But for now, Christina, tell people where they can find out more about you and where they can pick up a copy of your fascinating book.
Well, thank you, Sean. And thanks for letting me this is my favorite thing to talk about. And so if people are interested, my books are available worldwide at your favorite independent bookstore. If they don't stock it, they can order it in, or of course, any respectable online retailer, even the big ones. You can get it there. If you want to, kind of follow what I'm doing, you can. I have a website that I don't update enough, but you can follow us on Feral House, on all the social media channels, or my website at ChristinaWard.net.
For now, Christina, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.